think the memory of Rabaa has been a painful memory for all Egyptians, really, and a lot of people around the world have watched the tragedy as it unfolds live on the screens. It is one of those rare massacres where people were able to see that in 12 hours, in excess of 1,000 people had been killed. It works out at about a person killed every 30 seconds. There was no sparing of women or children, men, students, doctors, lawyers. As we have heard from the Arabic-speaking witnesses, there was no safe way out of Rabaa. And those who have been arrested on the way out and those who have been allowed to get out have been arrested. They have been on trial for the last 5 years. There are many people who have been in temporary detention because of this. We have Shawkan, who's a well-known photographer, for 5 years. Recently, Egyptian courts have requested the death penalty for 75 people who have actually managed to make their way live out of Rabaa. So the massacre, I'm afraid, and the injustice of Rabaa is still ongoing. I'm very pleased to welcome today Dr. Anas Takriti. He's the founder and CEO of Cordoba Foundation, which aims to bridge a gap between the Muslim world and the West. He's also the president of the Muslim Association of Britain. I welcome Dr. Maha Azam, head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. She was previously head of the Program on Security and Development on Muslim countries at the Royal United Services Institute, and she had been a fellow at Chatham's House for 13 years. She's a Kabul board member. If I may welcome Mr. Dawood Abdullah. He's the director of Middle East Monitor, which is a website, a news website most concerned with the Muslim world in the Middle East. He's the former Deputy Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. Emilia Smith, let me welcome you. Emilia is a journalist, a writer and a photographer. She's traveled extensively within the Middle East. She studied Arabic in the city of Alexandria, and she is interested in the area's politics. She writes extensively about the Middle East, and she has several excellent articles about Egypt. We're going to hear from all of them about Rabaa, and we will be joined later on by Mr. Mohammed Sudan, who is a member of the Freedom and Justice Party and was in the Foreign Bureau of the former Egyptian Parliament. So if I may start with Dr. Anas Takriti.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, Assalamu alaikum. It's a privilege to be part. I wanted to start off by saying it was a pleasure, but to be honest, I think it's very, very difficult to express pleasure at a remembrance of what has been described time and time again as being probably, arguably, the worst massacre in modern Egypt, and something that hasn't properly been addressed. And this is a point that I'll come to and outline even more extensively in the next few minutes. The Arab speakers earlier spoke quite eloquently, quite movingly, quite extensively and in great detail about their own testimonies, what they witnessed, what they saw themselves, and I don't think that any one of us can actually top that. A witness statement of someone who is in the midst of the rain of bullets and fire from all corners, someone whom at their hands a relative, a loved one, a friend died as a result of being shot by sniper bullets. I don't think that anyone can actually top that. And I'm not going to even try to override what we have heard today. It was rightly very emotional. It was rightly very moving. And that is an incredibly important part of trying to assess crises and calamities, the magnitude of which, what we're trying to assess, evaluate, remember, and then move on to actual actions, practices, plans, hopefully following today's discussion. I'm also joined on the panel by illustrious and quite esteemed speakers, not least Maha Azam, Mohammed Sudan and Amelia, who have first-hand also experience of Egypt before Rابعة, during Rابعة, and since Rابعة. So again, that is an area that I'm going to look forward to listening and hearing and learning from. I would, however, like to point out two things in the next few minutes. The first is what Rābi'a represents. And this is something which I personally find quite important, and sometimes absent from our discussions and our descriptions and illustrations of when we talk about Rābi'a. It is quite important. And I welcome the fact that the organizers today found it appropriate to start off and to kick off this event by an art exhibition, a remembrance of Rābi'a. I think it's extremely important that whilst the likes of myself talk on a political level, probably a little bit on an intellectual level, but really, this is about human beings. This is about people. People of all ages, of all genders, of all cultural backgrounds, of all intellectual orientations, of all political persuasions. It is quite important to reiterate the fact, as virtually every speaker has today, that this never was a confrontation between a brutal, murderous military regime and the Muslim Brotherhood. This was between a brutal, oppressive, murderous regime against Egypt, against Egypt's future, against the concept of freedom, against the concept of humanity. This was never about politics. This was all about power. Rābi'a represents something which, if we put into real perspective, the entire world would learn from. Similarly to the fact that the January 2011 revolution inspired the world, and had even the most advanced and progressive and liberal countries see grassroots movements demanding that they too also reform on every single level, just like the heroes of Maidan al-Tahrir did in Cairo. I recall to this day how protesters from the Occupy movement would take over a square in Manhattan, in New York, and raise a banner saying, "This is our Maidan al-Tahrir, this is our Tahrir Square." The symbolism reached all corners of the world. People who had never been to Egypt, people of all faiths and cultures and all colors, they responded to the scenes that they saw in the very heart of Cairo, which transformed the entire country through the coming together of all the powers, all the strands, all the tendencies of Egyptian society. They saw that, and it inspired them to overcome their own oppressors. At the time, I also recall a young American woman who raised the banner saying that whilst Mubarak was your oppressor, our oppressor is the financial system. Everyone found their own symbol of oppression, and they found their way in order to overcome that oppression, taking from the inspiration of the Egyptian people. And in the same way, we must always and also see the symbolic importance of Rab'a and how we can transfer that to all corners of the world in order to inspire what Rabi'a actually represented. We must never ever forget that Rabi'a manifested the coming together of people. It manifested the yearning for freedom. It represented the struggle for dignity, for human decency, equality, all the human values that we hold high. That is what Rabi'a was about. Rabi'a wasn't about politics. We sort of simplify it when we merely talk about Rabi'a as a political event. Rabi'a was much more than that. And that's why today when we hear the testimonies of those who were in Rabi'a, we hear about the medics, we hear about the engineers, we hear about the sound system specialists, we hear about the artists, we hear about the children, we hear about the women, we hear about the food, we hear about the kind of the culture that dominated those 6 weeks at Rabi'a and represented precisely what the vast majority of Egyptians sought in their lives throughout the country. That is the symbol of what people wanted Egypt to become. That kind of coming together. People from all classes, from all standards of wealth and luxury and the such or otherwise, coming together, sitting in, demanding very simple objectives, very simple aims, very simple goals, but ones that are at the very heart and core of humanity. The second part, which I try to escape mentioning simply because it leaves a very sour and bitter taste in one's mouth, but it must be mentioned. And that is the response of the world who watched not only as thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Egyptians sat in demand for very basic notions of humanity, forsaking everything, ultimately, everything, life and limb, everything, for the sake of those notions. We often hear about the West's struggle for freedom, for democracy. We talk in glowing terms about the French Revolution and what that brought, and how then the creation of the modern state, whereby human rights were acknowledged, whereby the struggle of the workers were recognized. We remember those. Yet, in the 21st century, with the most advanced modern technologies, we saw for ourselves, second by second, we saw that same struggle being crushed, being butchered, being absolutely eradicated with virtually no mention, no condemnation, no commentary that what is happening is a crime of the worst sort. A massacre that no one should ever allow to pass without utter condemnation. Yet we did. Those who pride themselves, including our country here, the United Kingdom, pride themselves on notions of democracy, freedoms, equalities, women's rights, protection of children, religious rights, political expression, all these notions that we pride ourselves so, yet we watched passively as those very notions were massacred, were butchered before our very eyes. That to me that to me shows that there is a degree of hypocrisy which the people of the world must come together and rise against. Because that is a level of hypocrisy that peoples of the world will one day come to meet themselves, God forbid. Britain, the governments of Europe, the government of the United States, having known, watched, observed, counted, gotten all the data and statistics of the crimes committed in Rابعة and thereafter, yet still sees fit to treat that butcher as though a respectable political leader that deserves the red carpet treatment wherever he travels. A regime that deserves that we conduct trade and commerce with openly and freely. That we describe in the most glowing of terms. That, my friends, condemns us. It condemns those governments. It condemns those very leaders who willingly extend their hands to shake the hands soaked in the blood of those who were killed and butchered in Rابعة. Rابعة has managed not only to speak on behalf of the Egyptian people, but it has managed to also display absolutely brutally the hypocrisy and double standards of the world that speaks so glowingly, so proudly of democracy and human rights, whilst watching gleefully as democracy and human rights were crushed. My friends, Rابعة poses a question that the world must come to answer. Exclusively, is the world today serious when it talks about democracy? Is the world serious when it talks about the eradication of non-violent transformations? Is the world serious when it talks about human rights? Is the world serious when it talks about women's rights? Is the world serious when it talks about the independence of the judiciary? Is the world serious when it asks and requests of nations around the world to adopt civil governments rather than military regimes? Because as we stand, it seems that the world is not. And that is problematic on so many levels. My dear friends, I look forward to hearing from my co-panelists. I have much to learn. Today I've learned so much, and I continue to learn. Rابعة continues to give. Rابعة continues to educate all of us and anyone who cares to recall those days in which tens, hundreds of thousands gathered together under the threat of being attacked, infiltrated, crushed at any given second for 6 weeks, day and night, and lived those hours. It gives hope. It gives hope that these same people will inspire a transformation very, very shortly, and not only in Egypt. Because of Rابعة, because of the coup that preceded Rابعة in Egypt, the Arab Spring, which I insist to call the Arab Spring, despite those who let down democracy in Egypt, calling it now the Arab Winter, I insist on calling it the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring began to regress. It was from that moment on. But that must remain, Rابعة must remain an inspiration for the peoples and nations of the Middle East, of North Africa, indeed the world over, that peaceful transformations can be had. They must be had. Rابعة poses a challenge to all humanity. And today, inshallah, from London, we respond positively. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your words of hope and inspiration. Appreciated the talk of Dr. Anas Takriti, and I do support your opinion that there is great duplicity and that Raba has exposed the West immensely in its treatment of its values of democracy when it happens in other areas other than Europe and the West. I'm now going to invite Dr. Mahaza to speak to us in this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Soham. And I'd like to thank Dr. Anas for really some extremely pertinent and important points regarding the international community. I think it's a strong message, it's a message that should go out beyond this meeting. Let me start by saying that we're 6 years on, and we hear a great deal about the massacre of Raba. It was clearly acknowledged that it was a massacre. A year on, the report of Human Rights Watch testified with evidence that this massacre was premeditated. It was planned at the highest echelons of the regime in Egypt, and that those that carried it out should be held accountable. 6 years on, no one has been held accountable. Neither the international order, international organizations, or, of course, any legal system within Egypt managed to bring anybody to account. The reason being that there is impunity, that those who rule Egypt today were the perpetrators of the crime. The military and the security services were the perpetrators of the crime. And the reason I want to start with that is to say 6 years on, after several massacres, and as we've heard today, Raba was not the first. The massacres began and the killing began immediately following the coup and preceded the coup, and have existed and continue to exist today. For over 60 years of military rule, the military has killed its own people. It continues to kill, to forcibly disappear, to torture, and to not allow any due process whatsoever, and to execute political dissidents. We need to concentrate on who the culprits are. And I want to concentrate on that precisely because 6 years on, we need to ask ourselves the question, those culprits, the military and the security forces that were responsible for Raba, that we are remembering today, that were responsible for the killing of innocent men, women and youth and children. That very military and security services continue to kill and to torture, but they haven't succeeded. We're still here, we're still refusing that military regime, and it hasn't been able to gain the legitimacy it wants in Egypt. It survives and it is in control, but it can only do so through the tank and through its military might. The message that I'm sending out today, and I shall say it later in Arabic to the media if they are still here, is that the Egyptians are living in a republic of fear. And the international community needs to recognize that it is supporting that republic of fear. It is complicit in what is happening to Egyptians today. And so long as the military regime in Egypt, with its security apparatus and its police force, is allowed to continue, And countries, democratic countries, continue to sell arms and do business and trade with this regime, the more they will become complicit in the death and torture of Egyptians. No one was held accountable after Raba, and they will not be held accountable. And those responsible for Raba can and will, in order to survive, be willing to commit further atrocities. But the Egyptian people need to also recognize that what happened in Raba was not against a particular group. Time that the majority of Egyptians today see the repercussions of. Had more Egyptians, although they were living in fear and the tanks were out, recognized then that the media was lying to them, that the media was playing its usual role of propaganda. Had more Egyptians then been willing to defend their democracy, they would have been free today. What happened in Rabaa was an act of revenge by the military regime. The military regime continues to carry out that revenge against Egyptians every day. It was sending a message in Rabaa, as it did in other massacres. Don't you dare call for freedom. Don't you dare stand up and oppose the rule of the military junta. And what happened in Rabaa was that there were thousands who said, no, we oppose. No, we will defend our nascent democracy and our elected president. No, we will defend our freedom. It was a challenge to the military regime as it had never been challenged before. And that is why those who stood in Rabaa remained the most honorable of Egyptians. They stood for Egypt's freedom. They stood for every Egyptian. But it is time that the rest of the Egyptian nation does the same, that it goes out and defends its freedom, that it says that every man, woman and youth that fell in Rabaa was us. Every sacrifice and victim that happened in Rabaa was every Egyptian citizen, because unless we do so, the Egyptian people will remain slaves to the military regime. The military junta is not going to grant any opening up or any freedom to the Egyptian people. It will have to be forced into that position. They have military might, but they are a minority, and the numbers opposing them are growing. They are growing by the day. The regime has failed. Despite Rabaa and despite the massacres and despite its military might, it is holding on to power, but it is losing the nation. It is losing Egyptians. And a regime can only stay in power for a certain amount of time if it is increasingly losing its support base. The barrier of fear will break in time, and the military regime will fall. But it should not be allowed to fall with impunity or be allowed to be given free exit. We have to bring the culprits to justice. And one or two points I'd like to make before I sum up, because I want to keep my message very short but very clear. The military regime needs to be put to justice, either within Egypt or outside Egypt. But we can close in on them, we can pressure them. And the route of international jurisdiction is an important one. We have to make sure in every country that there are Egyptian citizens or other citizens that want to carry this call, that arrest warrants are put out against those connected to this massacre or others, or are connected to the issue of torture. And we need to call on the new High Commissioner at the United Nations. She has been named now. Her name is Michelle Bachelet. She is of Chilean origin. She suffered under the right-wing military junta in Chile and was tortured herself. I urge everyone here in the future months when she takes up the post, as she takes up the post, to rally and to call for an inquiry into what happened in Rabaa, an inquiry into the violations that are happening in Egypt today and elsewhere, of course, in the region, and to call for justice. The Human Rights Council of the United Nations, several years ago, 24 countries, said very clearly that there was no accountability for what happened in Rabaa. We then need to pick up on that and to call with the report of the Human Rights Watch that appeared a year after Rabaa to say we want justice for the victims. We need to start pushing international organizations and the Human Rights, the Human Rights Commissioner, the upcoming Human Rights Commissioner, on this portfolio. What we do in Egypt and what we do in the region is our job. It is the job of those who are originally from that part of the world, people like us who are from Egypt, and those inside, to say that the struggle will continue against those who committed crimes against our own people, crimes that will not be forgiven, because we need to bring justice to the victims, and we need our country to move forward without a regime that will continue to perpetrate such crimes unless we end that regime and change it forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahazan, for an excellent summary and the talk you have given. I think stressed a few points. The first point being the impunity of the regime so far, and in calling for justice and in calling for an investigation into what happened in Rabaa, and for the world to stand up to its obligations for humanity and to help bring the perpetrators to justice either inside Egypt or outside. I think a very important point as well that you've highlighted is that Rabaa was truly the last public stand in Egypt where the people were able to say no. Since the Rabaa massacre happened, nobody has been able to say no to the coup regime in Egypt, which has then turned against the rest of the population there, even those who were against the regime of President Morsi. If I may invite now Dr. Dawood Abdallah to give us his thoughts about Rabaa this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suha. Thank you everyone for turning out today to commemorate the memory of all those who were killed at Rabaa. It is our duty to remember them and to pay tribute to the sacrifice that they made. There is, however, a section of the Egyptian society that I want to pay special tribute today, who were also victims of Rabaa. And that is the media institution, the journalists, those who died, who were killed, who were massacred in Rabaa, those who languish in prisons today across Egypt, and those who continue fearlessly to campaign for the freedom of expression, the right to free speech, to assembly, the right to information in Egypt. Fundamental rights as they are. These rights and this institution was also a victim of the coup in Egypt. And while we cannot bring back the human beings, the souls, the martyrs of Rabaa, we can preserve their memory, but we can, however, restore, re-establish, reconstruct the organs of the media industry in Egypt which has been dismantled systematically since 2013. It was inevitable that the military target the media institution, journalists from every walk of life. It was not an accident that they did so, because the journalists and the media, they provided the link. The journalists provided the link, you see, to the people. They informed, they created that awareness, they mobilized, they helped disseminate information in Egypt. And it was for this reason the military stepped in to bring that link between the people and the media. It was not, of course, just the satellite TV stations. One has to remember the new media, the citizen journalists, those who, with their cameras only, with their mobile phones, played a role in giving information, conveying messages, photographs, images of what transpired in those early days, those crucial days. And so in order to reverse the gains of the 25th January revolution, the military decided to break that link between the media and the people of Egypt. 2 months after the coup, 5 journalists were killed. And in the first hours of the coup, 4 TV stations were shut down, including Al Jazeera. 3 foreign journalists were expelled within those early hours on the grounds that their accreditation was not viable, was not suitable or accepted by the institutions. 28 staffers of Al Jazeera were detained in those early hours of the coup. And it tells us quite clearly, quite graphically, what was at stake here. That the issue of freedom of speech, the issue of information was crucial for the survival of the military regime. And that pattern of activity, that abuse, that assault against freedom of speech has continued ever since. Just in the last year, between May 2017 and February 2018, a total of 496 websites were closed across Egypt. 496. Today, there are 32 journalists in prison, as far as we know. There may be more that we don't know of. 22 of whom no charges were brought against them. For this reason, what we call Reporters Without Borders, this international monitoring body, ranks Egypt 161 out of a total of 180 countries in its World Freedom of Speech Index. This is the state of the Egyptian media today, and it is as a consequence of Raba. It is as much a victim. The media institution, the right to free speech, you see, is also a victim, and we must bear this in mind, and it can be restored. And so in their rush to quash the dreams, the hopes that were expressed in Raba in 2013, journalists today tried under what is called terror laws, anti-terror laws. This year, Times, this is the United Kingdom journalist reporter, Beltrue, was arrested in Egypt just around the time of the presidential elections, what they call presidential elections. she was given an ultimatum, either to accept a military trial or accept deportation. And she knew what a military trial would lead to. So she chose the deportation. She was simply covering the elections, what they call the elections. She was reporting it for this London-based newspaper. And so she accepted to be deported rather than to face a military trial, a kangaroo trial, and be imprisoned. There is always a charge for people like Trubel. That is what threat to national security. All those who were killed, who were massacred, every institution that has been dismantled poses a threat to what they call national security. I think when we move fast forward today and we examine what has happened in the last few months, the new media laws that were passed in June, just 2 months ago, it tells us, it embodies the tragedy, the magnitude of the crime that has been committed against the media and its institutions in Egypt. That bill restricts in a great way and takes back all the freedoms that were gained in the run-up to and during the overthrow of the Mubarak regime. I want to recall here, as we speak about the media, that the internet was introduced in Egypt before any other Arab country in 1993. No other Arab country. The media was, for all its weaknesses and all its shortcomings, it was more advanced than anywhere else in the Arab world in the early 90s. And the internet was introduced there before anywhere else. And there was hope, you see, that this would lead to a development of the culture, you see, of the industry, of freedoms. But that was not to be. The new regulations that I spoke of a few minutes ago, passed in June of this year, gives powers to 3 institutions, what is called the Supreme Council for the Media and Press, and the National Authority for the Media, National Authority for the Press. Every institution is supreme in Egypt. Supreme Military Council, Supreme Press Council, everyone is supreme. Supreme leader, the Fatah, as you see. The language of these laws are deliberately vague and ambiguous and leaves it open to abuses of rights so that anyone who speaks out in the media can be brought to book. So we have, and the most notorious and most controversial of these is what once called Article 19. It says, newspapers, media outlets, and websites are prohibited from publishing or broadcasting fake news. So what is fake news? So they set up what is called a hotline. And anyone in Egypt can call the hotline and say, this man, he broadcasted fake news. And then he will be arrested. It is open to abuse, this system. See? And all you have to say is, this individual broadcasted fake news. Within that Article 19 also is a very absurd notion that if an individual, because it includes personal accounts and blogs, so if you have 5,000 followers or more on your blog, that is considered a media outlet in Egypt today. Amelia may have about 10,000 followers. That would be a media outlet. And she would be subject to the new regulations. And she would have to seek permission, not only to publish, but even to attend events. Today, a journalist, he cannot attend a conference or an exhibition without getting permission from the media authority. That's the state of affairs today. So, but it was not a question of just intervening in the affairs of the media. They have sought absolute control, or taken absolute control of the media. They didn't tinker with the system, but today the military or institutions associated with the military own 95% of the TV channels in Egypt. 95%. So it's a field day for them. These institutions are not used only to cover up the corruption that takes place, of course, but most importantly, to defame, discredit, and assassinate the characters of those who speak against them. This is one of the primary functions, to discredit their opponents. And this is not something new in Egypt, particularly by the military. Some of you who are familiar with the history of Egypt would know that the founder of the CIA, Miles Copeland, he was in Egypt during the 1952 coup until 1955. And he said that the military had routinely used propaganda, you see, to discredit opponents of the 1952 coup, and also to justify the punishments that were meted out against their opponents during that period. The hangings, the detentions, the propaganda. But what is most, in my view, really disturbing, and I want to draw the parallels here, is that Miles Copeland said, and he was someone, he wrote in his book, he said that he had the most access to Gamal Abdel Nasser than any other Westerner during that. And the CIA loaned him an expert in black propaganda. An individual was sent from the United States by the CIA to help him in the propagation of his propaganda during that period. And the point I'm getting at here is that it is not beyond our heard recently the United States released $126 million in aid, which was frozen, but the current Trump administration released it. American taxpayers, British taxpayers, French taxpayers must stand up and hold their governments to account for what they do, the waste, the squander of our taxpayers' of money. Secondly, we have to continue to support the brave journalists, you see, who in one way or another continue to exercise their rights and to advocate for and to expose what is happening in Egypt. They need our support in every way. Of course, you see, in concluding, I would say that these abuses will not end overnight. They may seem to bring short-term benefit to the regime in Egypt and short-term benefit to the governments in the West who uses the Sisi regime. But in the long term, all of this will prove to be disastrous, will prove to be counterproductive. And Sisi himself, as he betrayed President Morsi, he will be betrayed one day by somebody within that military establishment. We know there are over 200 people now facing trial for attempted or so-called attempted assassination of Sisi. And we rest assured, I can say to you, rest assured somebody will betray him as he did to others, and that will be the end of this nefarious regime that has brought pain and misery to Egypt and destroyed all its social institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dawood Abdallah, for an excellent coverage of the situation of the media since the Rabaa massacre till today. I think one of the victims of the Rabaa massacre that we should not forget is Mick Dean. Mick Dean was a Sky News cameraman, a veteran man who worked in many war zones. He was shot and killed during the disruption of Rabaa sitting. We remember Habiba Ahmed Abdelaziz, another journalist and photographer who was killed, and there are many others who still remain in prison today. If I may now invite Amelia Smith to give us her thoughts about Rabaa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to this incredibly important event to commemorate the Rabaa massacre. I'd like to focus my talk today on the aftermath of Rabaa and the effect the massacre had on Egypt, on the country. And to do this, I'd like to use the example of North Sinai, Egypt's impoverished province along its border with Gaza, which is rarely ever talked about in the Western media. So during the Rabaa massacre, as we know, over 1,000 protesters were slaughtered to death in the square in a single day. And to this day, no single senior member of the military has ever been brought to justice over this incredible, shameful event. Yet, by contrast, something like 700 Egyptians have been either accused or tried of illegal protest and murder in relation to what happened in the square that day. And it's not just domestically, it's not just within Egypt where they have failed to bring anyone to justice. It's also the international community who barely made a noise, and the deafening silence from the international community in the aftermath of this massacre. And I really think this lack of accountability emboldened the Egyptian government's scorched earth policy across Egypt. The regime made the calculation after Rabaa that they could do whatever they wanted in Egypt to whoever they wanted in whichever part of Egypt they wanted to, and there would be absolutely no consequences whatsoever. I think Rabaa didn't end on the 14th of August. I think it's a symbol of failed democracy in Egypt, and I really think that the Rabaa massacre set a precedent for the Egyptian regime's brutality in Egypt. So when Sisi was campaigning to become president, he promised that he would develop North Sinai region. This is a province that has been ignored by successive governments. It's incredibly poor. But instead, he came to power and declared North Sinai a breeding ground for terrorists. And since October 2014, North Sinai has been under emergency law. It keeps being renewed every 3 months. This war on terror that's taking place in North Sinai now culminated in February earlier this year when the government launched Sinai 2018. And this was the government's idea to stamp out terrorism once and for all in North Sinai. And under this operation, the Egyptian government banned construction materials going into the province. It banned fuel for cars, cooking gas. It cut water and electricity and internet for the people living there to something like 2 to 4 hours a day. And all the schools and universities shut down. Since September 2015, the Egyptian government has killed 7,000 Egyptian citizens in North Sinai and imprisoned 25,000. So that's 2,300 Egyptians who have been killed by the Egyptian government and 8,300 a year. yes, there is an insurgency in North Sinai, but when we consider that it's estimated that there are around 1,000 militants at any one time in North Sinai, we can see that the government's policy or strategy there is completely disproportionate. And when we look at the kind of people who are victim to this strategy, we can see why Lodens more accurately described this as a war on civilians. So, on the 26th of July this year, Ibrahim Shaheen, who is 10 years old, was arrested from his house along with his uncle, his auntie. All his cousins were left at home with no one to look after them. No reason has ever been given for his arrest. And on the 30th of December last year, a 12-year-old boy, Abdullah al-Din, was in bed sleeping the night before an exam when Egyptian security forces entered his house, took him out of bed, threw him in a security truck and took him away. Just to clarify, this is in Arish, the capital of North Sinai. His parents didn't see him. He was forcibly disappeared. This 12-year-old boy was forcibly disappeared until July this year. And even now, he's reappeared, but his parents still haven't been allowed to see him. For me, one of the most shocking pieces of evidence that came out of North Sinai came in April, when a video was leaked by an Egyptian activist, and it showed a 17-year-old boy lying on the ground on the desert in North Sinai, begging for his mother, before an Egyptian soldier says, "Don't worry, your dad's coming," and then shoots him in the head no less than 10 times. So, a photo of this boy who was shot was circulated by the Egyptian government, by the army spokesman. He had bomb-making equipment, which had clearly just been placed next to him, and he was obviously called a terrorist. And then an Egyptian reserve army officer called Mohammed Amir then posted a picture of himself with a huge gun in Sinai and said, "I was the one who exterminated the terrorist." So this is an Egyptian regime who is killing 17-year-old boys in the desert and then boasting about it on Facebook. We know from the Raba massacre that the Egyptian regime doesn't spare children. We know from the children that suffocated from the tear gas by the mosque that it doesn't differentiate between men, women and children. Yet I think it's really important that we keep bringing attention to this, attention to the children who are caught up in the regime's war on terror, because I really think that this symbolizes or shows a regime that has totally lost its way, that does not have any boundaries left over what is right, what is wrong, what is the role of a regime and a government in a country. These photos, these videos of these young boys are just small snippets of what's happening in North Sinai, because the Egyptian government has banned human rights organizations, it's banned journalists from entering the province, and any journalist that does report critically on Sinai is sentenced to lengthy terms in prison, as we saw with the activist Ismail Iskandarani, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison in Egypt for reporting critically on operations in North Sinai. At the same time, the regime has gone to great efforts to push a PR campaign of themselves, of their campaign in North Sinai, that it's just, that it's heroic, and that it's successful. And 2 weeks ago, the regime invited foreign journalists to North Sinai. This was the first time in, I think, 3 years when international newspapers had actually gone in. They went into Al Arish, the capital of North Sinai, and what came out was a headline by CNC News saying life returns to normal in Egypt, and a quote from AFP saying there is fruit and vegetables aplenty in the markets, public transport is back on the road, universities have reopened. This pro-government line, therefore, was not just pushed by Arab news sites, it was also pushed by Western journalists, Western media. A version of these comments on North Sinai were pushed by Arab News, Times of Israel, CNC News, Daily Mail, Daily News Egypt, Arab News, and New China TV. Activists who you speak to in the region, who obviously didn't go on this government tour, will tell you that exactly the opposite, that life certainly has not returned to normal in North Sinai. As one of them recently told me, just because there's food in the markets, it doesn't mean that people have the money to buy it. Sinai University has moved all its operations to 6th of October City, which isn't even in Sinai, and 90% of farms in Sheikh Suwaid and Rafah have been completely razed to the ground. This is people's livelihoods. 20 villages have been completely demolished in Rafah, and Rafah City, which is right next to the border of Gaza, something like 3,000 homes have just been demolished, razed to the ground. So these are people who've lived side by side for centuries or decades, people who have extended family, and suddenly they just have no home, and many report that they haven't even been given any compensation, they have nowhere to go. So, one of the saddest things about what's happening in North Sinai is that not only are these severe human rights abuses taking place, but as I said, there is an insurgency, but the Egyptian government's war on terror is not working. They've proved themselves to be completely inept at fighting terror. This year alone, around 520 people have died from terror attacks, whereas in 2014, when Sisi's war on terror in the province...
Not any restriction of the human being in this dark world. It's hypocrisy world. I've been in Rabaa for 40 days. All the duration of Rabaa was 48 days. But I left Rabaa just to go to South Africa about the freezing the membership of Egypt in the African Union. Alhamdulillah, it's gone, but unfortunately, because of money, the membership came back. I came back from the airport to Rabaa Square because my soul was there. Everyone attended Rabaa, I believe many people from here. Even he was not there, but his body, but his soul was there also. I know thousands of people, they were following the square of Rabaa and Nahda every day through the TV channels because their souls were there, because they were looking for the future of their generations. Maybe we'll start from this point, maybe they're going to start from this square, looking for the freedom for our region. But unfortunately, this freedom is being killed. Our dream is being killed. I have been one of the delegation home meeting every other day, coming from abroad, Germany, Italy, Japan, and in many other countries. They were coming to meet with us to say, forget it. Your dream for the freedom, you should forget it. Go back to the brutal system. Go back for dictatorship system. Because you are as Egyptian, you don't deserve to live as a free people. our blood, starting from the 2nd of July, not from 3rd of July. We have a lot of massacres being forgotten. But this killing with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and his soldiers, either police or the army, they start to kill us from the 2nd day of July. If the people in Egypt saying that we obstruct the square of Rابعة for 48 days, which is not important square for the traffic in Cairo. We have to talk about the people of Tamarrud, where it's in Tahrir Square, started from January 2013 till the 30th of June 2013. No one talks about this. No one talks about the obstruction of the traffic in the very important square in Egypt. Why? Because they've been supported by the intelligence, by the military, by the police in Egypt and everywhere else. And that time Morsi was the leader of Egypt. He said that this is the democracy. Let them sit in, don't treat them or any harsh. Don't harm any one of them. That was a democracy. What happened in Rابعة? People were praying, were fasting the 30 days of Ramadan in atmosphere very bad, crowded people living in tents, a very, very hot weather, 46 degrees. Everyone was respecting the others, cooperating. A very high level of a group lived in the streets. I have met a lot of journalists in Rابعة Square. One of them, she was an Egyptian. She was no hair skirt. She told me, when I enter Rابعة Square, I feel that I'm a queen. And then when I asked her, how that? She told me, I come here and I go to Tahrir Square, which is Tamarrud is there. When I come here, even this kind of crowded, I have been respected by everyone. Even I'm not with hijab, but he opened the road to me. No one touched me. But if I am going to Tahrir Square, while Tamarrud is there, everyone harassing me. That was the difference between this kind of atmosphere. Prayer people, very respected people, even they are Christians, even they are non-Muslims. But that was the way of those people cooperate together, respect everyone, respect the women, and never forget Rابعة. Even the day of the dismissal from the bloodshed in Rابعة. That was, I never forget, I was not there because I've been ordered early in the morning to get out of the Rابعة Square by the leaders. But I cannot. I was very close. And then I went to Iman Square, Iman Mosque. Just one little story to tell you about what happened in Iman Square. I met with a mother and a father just coming from abroad to look for their son. And then the lady get in the mosque. There are a lot of born dead bodies. She just get the cover. Is that my son? No, this is my son. No one can recognize these people, these bodies. You cannot know them. You cannot recognize these bodies belong to. And then she started to cry, this woman. And she told me, why you go peaceful against those people? This peaceful way is not right. You are cowards. Because you treat with this killer with a peaceful way. That was wrong. Where is my son? Tell me, where is my son? Even he's been burned, where his body? I cannot say anything to this lady. I start to cry. those people who did in Rابعة, I don't never think that they are human. They are not Egyptians. No one can do this. Kill the people under the table of surgery, and then burn the hospital, the field hospital, burn the mosque. Why? Wait for them. We were peacefully sitting for 48 days, do nothing, just pray, recite Quran, and call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take this crisis over the democracy. I know that was long days. There are a lot of things we can say about the Rابعة day and all the massacres between and before or after Rابعة day, but this was a black points against the Egyptian military, against the Egyptian police. No one from the Egyptian will never forget this day or never forget these massacres. All our life we're gonna put the Egyptian army, Egyptian police, that they were criminals. They commit a worst massacre in this recent century, and we never forget that was them. And we tell all the families of the murderers, all the families of the people who are being arrested or still behind bars, that one day we will gain our freedom back, we will gain our dignity back, because we never forget that blood which been sold in these days or in this land. Thank you very much for everybody here, and we look forward, inshallah, to gain our freedom and dignity back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sudan, for your testimony about what was happening in Rابعة and what we saw. Thank you very much for all our panelists for their fine words, which I think covered all the political, local, international, and media aspects of Rابعة and what happened and the implications of Egypt since then. This is the 5th year for the Rابعة 5th memorial for Rابعة, and we hope that in the future, in the very near future, the perpetrator can be, all the perpetrators can be brought to justice, and the West will take the stand it should against these massacres that occur in Egypt. I'd like to draw the this session to a close. We will take a 20-minute break, and then we can come back for questions and for further parts of the program. So thank you very much for your attendance, and please give a big hand for our panelists. Thank you.
رجعك شمس النهار Esperanza por vivir, libres decidieron salir, por lo que piensan murieron, no los podemos olvidar, no los podemos olvidar. يا حر مين حينامتك وانت اللي ثابتة خطوتك متعلمات صاحبك عليك ووقت تروح عن سكتك شدت عروقك في الهتاف خلت جيوش الزيف تخاف يا عمري عايشينك عجاف من حق يملك الاختيار من حق يملك الاختيار